Dr. Mara Calloway had been reviewing patient intake files for 40 minutes when the name appeared on her screen. Richard Hensley. I set down my coffee. The ceramic made a soft click against the desk that I still remember, the way small sounds become loud when the blood leaves your face. His chart had been transferred to Calloway Biopharmaceuticals, compassionate use portal 2 days earlier, by a Dr. Amara Osaibansu at Meridian Oncology Partners in Scottsdale. Stage IV non-small cell lung cancer. KRAS G12C mutation confirmed, refractory to 2 prior lines of chemotherapy. Life expectancy, unmedicated, 4 to 7 months. And the drug he needed, the only FDA-approved targeted therapy for his specific mutation profile, was called Calicept. I had named it myself. I had spent 11 years of my life building it. The approval for its compassionate use expansion had required my personal sign-off, filed with the FDA's Office of Oncology Products on March 14th of this year, 7 weeks before his oncologist's office placed that call. Richard Hensley, who had called me a liability. Richard Hensley, who had signed my termination paperwork and escorted me from the building on a Tuesday afternoon in November while his assistant watched from the hallway. Richard Hensley needed my drug to survive. I read his file for a long time without moving. The drug was mine. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. I spent a long time thinking I was the only one who had lived inside that particular kind of silence, and I was wrong. Every week someone reaches out who knows exactly what this feels like. But to understand why that moment meant what it did, why I sat in that chair and read his file 3 times before I picked up the phone, I have to take you back, 14 years back, to a Tuesday in November that started a different way and ended the same. I was 31 years old when Richard Hensley fired me, and I had done everything correctly. That is the part that took me the longest to make peace with, not the firing itself. Not even the way he did it, the flat voice, the sealed envelope, the escort to the elevator by a man named Tom whose last name I never learned. What took years to metabolize was the simple, documented fact that I had followed every protocol. I had flagged every violation through the correct internal channels. I had submitted written reports on September 3rd, September 19th, and October 7th of that year to the compliance office at Hensley Biosciences Research Division on the 4th floor of a building on Research Boulevard in Austin, Texas. I had done what a responsible research scientist was supposed to do, and it had cost me everything. Richard Hensley ran his company the way a man runs something he has never had to earn. He had inherited the initial capital from his father, built the first division on the strength of 2 licensed compounds he had acquired rather than developed, and had cultivated, over 15 years, the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was 54 when I worked for him. He wore expensive shoes and remembered everyone's name, which people mistook for warmth. I had been a research associate at Hensley Biosciences for 3 years when I discovered the irregularities. The clinical trial data for their lead compound, a targeted therapy for KRAS-driven tumors they were positioning for accelerated FDA review, had been selectively reported. 3 adverse event clusters from the Phase II cohort had been reclassified in a way that, in my assessment, did not reflect the actual patient outcomes. I am not going to dress that up. Someone had altered the way the data was summarized, and the alteration made the drug look safer than the raw data supported. I flagged it. Richard called me into his office on October 22nd. His office had a view of the parking structure and 2 framed patents on the wall. He sat behind a desk that was too large for the room and looked at me the way someone looks at a slow driver blocking traffic. "Mara," he said, not Dr. Calloway, not even Ms. Calloway, you filed 3 separate compliance concerns in 6 weeks. The data discrepancies are real, I said. What you're calling discrepancies are judgment calls made by people with considerably more experience in regulatory submission than you have. He folded his hands. This is not a teaching hospital. I need team members who advance the work, not ones who create friction. I have documentation, he smiled. I know you do, you're very thorough. He said thorough the way some people say stubborn. I'd like you to think carefully about whether this is the kind of company you see yourself growing with. 2 weeks later, Tom from facilities handed me a sealed envelope in the lobby. The termination letter cited performance concerns and cultural fit. There was a severance offer of $14,200, 3 months of my salary, contingent on signing a non-disparagement agreement. My attorney at the time, a woman named Linda Chukwumeka at Chukwumeka and Farrell LLP in Austin, reviewed it and told me it was standard language designed to ensure my silence. I signed it. I was 31. I had $6,800 in my checking account and student loans that did not care about non-disparagement agreements. I had no family money to fall back on. I had no partner. I had a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Austin and a research background in oncology pharmacology that was now attached to a termination. I signed the agreement, took the $14,200, and did not sleep for 4 days. On the fifth day, I drove to the University of Texas Library on Speedway Boulevard and sat at a terminal for 3 hours. I looked up every pharmaceutical research fellowship I was eligible to apply for. I wrote down the name of one program on a piece of paper, the Whitmore Ashford Pharmaceutical Research Fellowship at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, which funded independent research scientists with documented oncology expertise. I folded the paper and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. The application to the Whitmore Ashford program required 3 letters of recommendation, a research proposal not to exceed 5,000 words, and a career statement. I had 18 months of documented research at Hensley Biosciences on my record, which I was forbidden to discuss in specific terms under the terms of my non-disparagement agreement. I had a master's degree in biochemistry from the University of Texas at Austin and a letter of support from my graduate advisor, Dr. Francis Obi, who had been trying to get me to pursue a doctorate for 2 years before I took the industry job. I wrote the research proposal in my apartment over 3 weekends. It was about KRAS G12C inhibition, specifically, about the protein interaction dynamics that had made the mutation so resistant to prior small molecule approaches. I had been thinking about this problem since my second year at Hensley, and I had thought about it without the ability to discuss it with anyone who was paid to care. The first application was rejected. The letter arrived in February, 11 weeks after I submitted. It was 2 paragraphs. The program received 412 applications annually and could fund 9. My proposal, the letter said, showed promise, but my current affiliation was unclear, a polite way of noting that I was unemployed and had been since November. I applied for a temporary position as a research coordinator at Austin Community Health Sciences Institute the same day I received the rejection. The pay was $41,000 a year. It was not research. It was data entry and scheduling, with the word coordinator in the title to make it feel like something else. I took it. I reapplied to the Whitmore Ashford program the following November, this time with a current institutional affiliation, a revised proposal that was sharper and more specific, and a third letter of recommendation from Dr. Constance Marbury, the Director of Research Operations at Austin Community Health Sciences Institute, who had watched me rewrite a clinical data protocol in my 3rd week on the job and had quietly asked where I had trained. "You're wasted here," Dr. Marbury told me in December, over bad coffee in the break room. She said it simply, without drama, the way someone states a fact that has been apparent for a while. "What are you actually trying to do?" I told her about the KRAS problem, about the biology I had been thinking about for 2 years, about the proposal. She read it that weekend. On Monday, she wrote me the best letter of recommendation I have ever read, and I know this because she showed it to me before she sealed it. My mother called me around this time. She lived in Houston and we spoke every few weeks. I told her I was still at the coordinator job. I did not tell her about the fellowship application. My sister, who lived in Dallas, texted occasionally to ask if I was seeing anyone. No one asked about my career in any specific way. There was a particular texture to their indifference that I had learned to recognize. It was not cruelty, exactly. It was the comfortable absence of expectation. They had decided, at some point I could not precisely locate, that I was the family member whose career was difficult to explain at Thanksgiving. When the Whitmore Ashford acceptance arrived in March, I was alone in my apartment. I read it twice. I put it on the kitchen counter. I made dinner. I called no one. My health insurance coverage at Austin Community Health Sciences Institute ran through the end of the following month. I had 37 days to figure out continuation coverage before I moved to Baltimore. I started making lists. The Whitmore Ashford Fellowship placed me in the laboratory of Dr. Samuel Equincy at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine's Department of Oncology Pharmacology, specifically in the Harrison Research Building on Monument Street in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Equincy ran what was then one of the most productive KRAS research groups in the country, and he had selected my proposal from the 9 funded that year because, he told me in our first meeting, it was the only one that treated the G12C mutation as a structural chemistry problem rather than a screening problem. Everyone else is running assays looking for lucky hits, he said. He had a way of speaking that was precise and unhurried, like someone who had long ago decided that clear sentences were worth the extra moment they required. You're trying to understand the pocket geometry. That's either brilliant or a waste of 3 years. I think it's brilliant, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Good. So do I. The fellowship provided $67,000 annually and covered my medical records transfer, my relocation, and basic laboratory access. I supplemented with a graduate teaching appointment that added $12,400 a year. I lived in a 2-room apartment in Charles Village, 9 minutes by bike from the Harrison Building, and I worked the way people work when they are building something that belongs entirely to them. The structural chemistry approach to the KRAS G12C pocket was not new as a concept. What was new, what I believed was new, and what the next 2 years would confirm, was a specific interaction model I had developed that identified a secondary allosteric binding site adjacent to the classical switch II pocket. I had seen the geometry of it in computational modeling during my last year at Hensley, in the hours after the rest of the team went home, on my own laptop, using open-source molecular dynamics software. I had never published it. I had never discussed it with Richard Hensley or anyone at his company. It was mine in the only way that something can be completely yours. I had thought of it alone, at night, and told no one. By the end of my first year in Baltimore, I had enough preliminary data to present at the American Association for Cancer Research annual meeting in April. Dr. Equincy submitted the abstract on my behalf. The talk was in a session with 400 attendees. I was 33 years old and I stood at the podium with my data on the screen behind me and explained, for the first time in public, why I believed the secondary allosteric site was the key to cracking covalent inhibitor selectivity in KRAS G12C. The response was skeptical. One researcher, a senior scientist from a large pharmaceutical company whose name I will not use here, asked during the Q&A whether I had considered that the binding geometry I was describing might be a computational artifact. He said it with the patient tone of someone correcting a student. He said it in front of 400 people. I've considered it, I said. I've also validated the geometry in 3 independent crystallography runs. Do you want the PDB accession codes? He did not. Dr. Equincy said nothing until we were in the elevator afterward. Then he said, PDB accession codes, beautiful. I started the PhD program at Johns Hopkins that fall. Dr. Equincy supervised. I was 33, beginning a doctorate in pharmacological chemistry, living on $79,400 a year combined, keeping meticulous medical records of my own health because I could not afford to miss time in the lab, working towards something that I had not named yet but could feel the shape of. My sister called in October to tell me she had been promoted at her firm in Dallas. I told her that was wonderful. She asked if I was still doing research at Johns Hopkins. I said yes. She said she didn't really understand what that meant exactly. I said it was okay. She had no idea what I was building. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. I completed the doctorate in 4 years, which Dr. Equincy said later was the fastest completion he had ever supervised in his department without some compromise of quality. I did not experience it as fast. I experienced it as a series of long nights in the Harrison Building, with cold coffee and molecular dynamics output that was either going to confirm my model or demolish it. On February 11th, I remember the date because it was also my father's birthday, and I thought about calling him and then did not. The crystallography data from the 4th validation run came back from the Johns Hopkins Structural Biology Core at 11:47 in the evening. The secondary allosteric site was real. The binding geometry was exactly what I had modeled. The computational artifact question was definitively answered. I sat in the empty lab and looked at the data for a long time. I thought about the non-disparagement agreement. I thought about the sealed envelope. I thought about Tom from facilities and his lanyard. I thought about Richard Hensley's patient smile and his framed patents and his opinion of what constituted a judgment call. Then I opened a new document and started writing the paper. It published in Nature Chemical Biology 14 months later. The response was not skeptical. By the time I defended my dissertation in June, 2 pharmaceutical companies had reached out about licensing discussions. I had consulted with one attorney, a man named David Reinhold at Reinhold Morgenstern LLP in Baltimore, who specialized in pharmaceutical intellectual property. David was 47, methodical, and had a habit of reading licensing term sheets the way a surgeon reads a scan, slowly, from the edges in. He had reviewed my intellectual property position across the work I had done in the Equincy lab and confirmed what I had suspected. The secondary allosteric site model and the inhibitor design approach that followed from it were independently developed and fully protectable. "You have something here," he told me in his office on Charles Street, surrounded by filing boxes that made the room feel smaller than it was. "The question is whether you want to license it or build it." I knew the answer before he finished the sentence. I spent the following 18 months completing a postdoctoral position in translational oncology at the NIH's National Cancer Institute Satellite Program in Bethesda, Maryland, where I worked under Dr. Priya Natarajan, a woman who had spent 30 years moving molecules from computational theory to clinical application, and who had read my Nature Chemical Biology paper before I interviewed. She offered me the postdoc position in the same email in which she acknowledged my application. She did not make me wait. Dr. Natarajan became, over those 18 months, the person who knew my full story. Not in a single conversation, she was not someone who elicited confessions. But over lunches in the NCI cafeteria, over data reviews that ran long, over the occasional evening when the work required 2 people to make sense of it, she accumulated the shape of where I had come from. She knew about Hensley Biosciences. She knew about the non-disparagement agreement and the sealed envelope and the $14,200 and Tom from facilities and the nonspecific performance concerns. She knew about the paper in my wallet. She had a way of listening that was still and complete, and she never said anything that required me to minimize the experience in order to make her comfortable. "You protected your work," she said once. "At every stage, you protected it. That's not nothing." "It was the only thing I could control," I said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I mean." I left the NIH postdoc in August with a clear path. David Reinhold had spent 8 months helping me structure the intellectual property framework for what would become Callaway Biopharmaceutical. The company was incorporated in Delaware in September, with principal offices established in Rockville, Maryland. Seed funding came from a life sciences venture fund, Meridian Crest Capital, whose managing partner, a man named Victor Ashby, had read the Nature Chemical Biology paper and then read it again before he called David's office. The company's lead program was the development of a covalent KRAS G12C inhibitor derived from the secondary allosteric site model. It had no name yet. I called it the compound internally, in my own notes, because naming it felt like a commitment I was not ready to make until I knew it worked. It would take 5 more years before it had a name. It took 5 more years of IND applications, phase I dose escalation studies, phase II efficacy data across 3 tumor cohorts, an FDA advisory committee meeting at which I presented for 40 minutes to a panel of 14 oncologists and regulatory scientists, and a new drug application review process that lasted 11 months before the approval letter arrived. During those 5 years, my mother developed a kidney condition that required specialist appointments with a nephrologist at Houston Methodist. I helped her navigate her insurance policy. She had Medicare and a supplemental plan with gaps in her prescription coverage that required several calls to sort out. And I did this on the phone from my office in Rockville without telling her the name of the company I was running. She knew I worked in pharmaceuticals. She knew I was a scientist. She did not know what I had built. During those 5 years, my sister in Dallas bought a house and asked if I had a financial advisor, and I said yes. She did not ask what I was advising about. We did not discuss college fund projections for her children or retirement, savings timelines, or investment property in the way that 2 adults who talked regularly about real things would have. We discussed the surface of each other's lives at predictable intervals and called it staying in touch. During those 5 years, I ran clinical trials, hired 47 people, negotiated a co-development agreement with a larger pharmaceutical partner, and managed a cash position that at one point in 2021 dropped low enough that David Reinhold and Victor Ashby and I spent 3 consecutive evenings on a call restructuring our bridge financing before a $23 million series B closed with 4 days to spare. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. The compound, my compound, received FDA approval for the treatment of adult patients with KRAS G12C mutated non-small cell lung cancer on January 28. I was in the Rockville office at 7:14 in the morning when the approval letter arrived by secure electronic transmission from the Office of Oncology Products. My vice president of regulatory affairs, a man named Jerome Ake, who had joined Callaway Biopharmaceutical from the FDA itself 4 years earlier, walked into my office holding his laptop with an expression I had not seen on him before. "It's done," he said. I had worked for 11 years toward a single biological problem that began on a laptop after hours in a company that had fired me for telling the truth. The drug that emerged from that problem was real. It was approved. It was mine in every legal and scientific and human sense of the word. I called Dr. Natarajan. She answered on the second ring and said, "I know, I saw it come through." "How do you feel?" I thought about that for a moment. I was standing at the window of my office in Rockville, looking at a parking lot in early morning light. "I feel like something finished," I said. 3 months later, Dr. Amara Osaibansu at Meridian Oncology Partners in Scottsdale submitted a compassionate use request for a patient whose KRAS G12C mutation had proved refractory to 2 prior treatment lines. I was the designated signatory on all compassionate use applications for Calicept. The request came through the standard portal. Jerome flagged it for my review on a Wednesday morning. The patient's file contained his diagnosis, his prior treatment history, his oncologist's clinical notes, his demographic information, and his name, Richard Hensley. I had not seen or spoken to that name in 8 years. I had not needed to. I had signed a non-disparagement agreement, and I had built everything that followed from the principle that the work was the answer, not the confrontation, not the vindication speech, not the moment where I showed up at his door with a certificate and a grievance. The work was the answer. I had believed that for 8 years, and now Richard Hensley's oncologist had sent his file to my company. And I was the only person in the world with the authority to approve or deny his access to the one drug that could give him more time. Jerome was standing in the doorway when I looked up from the file. "Do you need anything?" he asked. I looked at his file again. Prognosis without treatment, 4 to 7 months. I thought about the sealed envelope. I thought about the $14,200. I thought about Tom from facilities and the word liability spoken in a voice designed to end a career. I thought about the paper I had folded and kept in my wallet for 6 years. Then I picked up the phone and called Dr. Osaibansu's office directly. Dr. Amara Osaibansu answered on the third ring. He had a clear, precise voice, the kind that belongs to someone who has delivered difficult news many times and has learned to give information without flinching from it. "Dr. Callaway," she said, "thank you for calling directly. I wasn't certain this would come to you personally. The compassionate use applications for Calicept require my sign-off," I said, "all of them at this stage of the expansion protocol." There was a brief pause. "Then you've seen the file." "I've seen the file." Another pause, shorter. "I want to be transparent with you. The patient is aware that Calicept is manufactured by Callaway Biopharmaceutical. He is not aware of any prior relationship between you and his former employer. I don't know if that context is relevant to you." I looked at the window again. The parking lot, the early light. "My job is to evaluate whether the patient meets the clinical criteria for compassionate use access," I said. "His prior relationship with me is not a clinical criterion." "No," she said. "It isn't. Does he meet the criteria?" She walked me through the file. The KRAS G12C mutation confirmed by next-generation sequencing, the 2 prior treatment lines, the performance status, the organ function parameters. He met every criterion. He met them clearly. "Schedule the access consultation," I said. "I'll have Jerome Ake from my regulatory affairs team reach out to your office to coordinate the documentation." I hung up. I sat in the quiet for a moment. Jerome was still in the doorway. "Approved?" he asked. "Approved," I said. He nodded once and went back to his office. I stayed at my desk and thought about what I had just done, which was the only thing I could have done. Not because of sentiment and not because of strategy. Because Richard Hensley had a KRAS G12C mutation and a life expectancy of 4 to 7 months without treatment, and I had built the drug that could change that, and the clinical criteria were met. The work was the answer. It had always been the answer. Even now. But Richard Hensley did not know yet who had signed his access form, and in the 2 days between that phone call and the consultation his oncologist's office had scheduled at a conference room in Rockville, something happened that changed the shape of what was coming. His son called my company's main line. His name was Carter Hensley. He was 28 years old, and I knew this because his father's next of kin information was in the patient file, and because Jerome had flagged the call log from Tuesday morning with a note that said, "Family member inquiring about cost-sharing options for compassionate use access and requesting to speak with someone in patient services." Jerome had transferred the call to our patient access coordinator, a woman named Felicity Drummond, who had been with Callaway Biopharmaceutical for 3 years, and who handled exactly these conversations with a competence and care that I trusted completely. Felicity had spoken with Carter Hensley for 22 minutes. She had explained the compassionate use program's cost structure, which, under our current access policy, was provided at no cost to patients without commercial insurance coverage for the indication, and she had answered his questions about the timeline. Carter Hensley had then asked, according to Felicity's call notes, whether he could speak with the person who had approved his father's application. Felicity had said she would pass along the request. I read the call notes on Wednesday evening, sitting at my desk with the door closed. I read them twice. Then I read them a third time, specifically the part where Carter Hensley had described the situation to Felicity. His father had been diagnosed 4 months ago, he said. The family had been managing it privately. They had health insurance coverage through his father's retirement plan, but the coverage had a gap for this specific indication because the drug had only recently received approval and the insurance policy had not yet been updated to reflect it. They were looking at significant out-of-pocket medical expenses. I sat with that for a long time. Richard Hensley had fired me over a non-disparagement agreement worth $14,200. His son was calling my company's patient access line because the insurance policy gap was creating financial pressure. The specific drug they needed, the drug whose development I had funded through bridge financing that came within 4 days of collapsing, the drug I had run 5 years of clinical trials to prove worked, was mine. I called David Reinhold that evening. Not about Richard Hensley. Not yet. About something else that had been developing for 6 weeks that I now understood I needed to move on. 3 days before the compassionate use application had arrived in my portal, I had received a certified letter from an estate attorney in Austin, Texas. A man named Gregory Pfeiffer at Pfeiffer Caldwell LLP. The letter had informed me, in precise legal language, that Richard Hensley had updated his estate documents in February, 2 months after his diagnosis, and that the update included a bequest to Hensley Biosciences Charitable Foundation that specifically referenced a research grant program in oncology pharmacology. The foundation had named Callaway Biopharmaceutical as a potential grant recipient. The letter had asked whether I was willing to be contacted regarding the terms. I had put the letter in a folder and said nothing to anyone for 3 days because I had needed to think about what it meant. Now, sitting at my desk on a Wednesday evening with Carter Hensley's call notes in front of me, I understood what it meant. Richard Hensley knew exactly who I was. He had known before the compassionate use application was submitted. He had updated his will, named my company, and then had his oncologist submit the access request. I signed the first document that night. There was no going back. I called David Reinhold at 8:15 in the evening, and he answered because David Reinhold answered calls at 8:15 in the evening when I was the one calling, which was one of the reasons I had worked with him for 9 years. "You've read the Pfeiffer letter," he said, before I had said anything beyond hello. 3 days ago, I said, I needed to think, and now you're done thinking. I want to understand the legal architecture before the consultation on Friday, I said. I want to know what a bequest from Hensley to my company's foundation, combined with an active compassionate use application, creates in terms of any obligation or conflict of interest question. Sit down, David said. This is a long answer. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. David's view, and he walked me through the legal reasoning carefully, the way he always did, was that the estate documents and the compassionate use application were legally independent. My approval of the compassionate use request was a clinical and regulatory decision, governed by FDA guidelines and my company's established access protocols. The bequest in his will was a private estate matter that had no bearing on clinical criteria. There was no conflict of interest under FDA guidelines because the access decision was protocol-driven, not discretionary in the relevant sense. You approved him because he met the clinical criteria, David said. Which he did. He did. Then you are on entirely solid ground. The question is what you want to do about the estate matter. I told David what I wanted to do. He was quiet for a moment. That's an unusual position, he said. It's the right one, I said. I know it is, he said. That's not the same as unusual. He agreed to contact Gregory Pfeiffer at Pfeiffer Caldwell LLP in Austin and request a full copy of the relevant trust documents and financial disclosure associated with the estate provision. I wanted to see the actual language before the consultation. I wanted to understand what Richard Hensley had written before I sat across from his son. David called me back Thursday morning. He had the documents. He read me the relevant section over the phone, slowly, so I could write it down. The bequest was specific. It allocated $400,000 from Richard Hensley's estate to the Hensley Biosciences Charitable Foundation, earmarked for a research grant to be awarded to a scientist working in KRAS-targeted oncology therapeutics. The document named Callaway Biopharmaceutical by name. It named me by name. And there was a handwritten addendum, not legally binding in the same way as the formal trust documents, but included with the filing, that was 4 sentences long. The addendum said, I made an error in judgment in November of that year. The science was sound. The scientist deserved better. This is what I can do now. I wrote those 4 sentences on a notepad and looked at them for a long time. Felicity knocked on my office door at 10:30. She had the Friday consultation logistics, the conference room on the 3rd floor, the participants, the time. Are you all right? She said. Yes, I said. Thank you, Felicity. She looked at me a moment longer the way people do when they believe you and are also not entirely sure. Then she nodded and left. I thought about a patient I had met during the Phase II clinical trial, a woman named Denise Korteng, 51 years old, a former high school biology teacher from Cleveland who had enrolled in the trial in its 2nd cohort. She had been the first patient in whom I had seen the drug work in the way I had designed it to work, the tumor burden shrinking on successive scans, the mutation responding to the inhibitor exactly as the structural chemistry model predicted. Denise had sent me a note after the trial completed. It was 3 paragraphs, handwritten, and it was sitting in my desk drawer in a folder I did not often open, but also did not put away. The last line of her note said, I don't know how to thank someone for the fact that I can still see my students' faces. I opened the drawer and read the note again. Then I closed it and went to prepare for Friday. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. Not because I had a legal strategy and a 9-year relationship with David Reinhold and a set of trust documents on my desk. Because I had always known what the work was for. They had never understood that. They still didn't. And by Friday afternoon, that understanding would change. Carter Hensley arrived at the Callaway Biopharmaceutical offices on Friday at 10:55, 5 minutes early. He was accompanied by a woman he introduced as his aunt, Patricia Hensley Greer, his father's sister. Richard Hensley himself was not present. He was in Scottsdale, managing his treatment schedule, and Dr. Osai Bonsu had advised against travel. Carter was tall and had his father's way of carrying himself, upright, comfortable, assured. He was dressed in a dark jacket over a blue shirt, and he shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who has been taught that a firm grip communicates seriousness. He said it was good to meet me. He said he appreciated the company's responsiveness. He said his father was grateful for the access to the program. He did not know who I was beyond my name and my title on the Callaway Biopharmaceutical letterhead. I showed them into the 3rd floor conference room where Felicity and Jerome were already seated. I introduced them both. I offered water. I sat down across from Carter and Patricia and folded my hands on the table and looked at them with the expression I had spent 14 years learning, which was the expression of someone who is in the correct room at the correct time and has nothing to prove. I want to make sure I understand your father's situation correctly, I said. Dr. Osai Bonsu has briefed me on his clinical picture, but it would help me to hear from you about the family's understanding of the Access program and what questions you have. Carter nodded and began talking. He talked about the diagnosis, about the timeline, about the prior treatment lines that had not worked. He talked about the insurance policy situation, the health insurance coverage gap for the new indication, the medical expenses they were managing, the fact that the supplemental coverage through his father's retirement plan had a lag in its formulary updates that their insurance broker was working to resolve. He used the word grateful several times. He used the phrase, "We're not people who ask for things," which I noted internally. Patricia Hensley Greer said less. She was watching me with the particular attention of someone who is trying to determine whether they are being managed. "I want to clarify the cost structure," Carter said. "We understand the program provides access at no cost, but we want to make sure we're not. We want to understand what that means going forward." "Under our current compassionate use policy," I said, "patients who meet the clinical criteria and who lack complete commercial insurance coverage for the indication receive access at no cost to them or their family for the duration of the treatment course. Your father qualifies on both the clinical and coverage grounds." Carter looked slightly relieved. Thank you, that's more than we expected." I looked at him for a moment. "Carter," I said, "there's something I want to tell you before we continue, something I think you should know going into this." The room was very quiet. She thought she had walked into a standard access consultation. She had 2 more days before she understood that David Reinhold had already filed the response to Pfeiffer's letter, and that the document arriving at Pfeiffer Caldwell LLP in Austin that afternoon would change the entire shape of what was coming. I had not planned to tell Carter Hensley in that room. I had planned to handle it through David and Gregory Pfeiffer in the normal course of the estate matter, which was the clean, institutional way to do it. But Carter was sitting across from me saying, "We're not people who ask for things," with his father's posture and his father's grip, and I understood that what this room actually required was the truth. "I worked at Hensley Biosciences," I said. "I was a research associate in the oncology pharmacology division. I left the company in November of that year, 14 years ago." Carter went very still. "Your father was the CEO who signed my termination paperwork," I said. The stated reason was performance concerns and cultural fit. The actual reason was that I had filed 3 written compliance reports regarding clinical trial data irregularities in the company's lead compound. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system. Patricia Hensley Greer said, "I don't understand why you're telling us this." "Because you came to my company," I said. "Because the drug your father needs is the drug I built. And because I think you deserve to understand the full shape of the situation you're in." Carter's jaw was set. Something moved through his expression, not quite anger, not quite recognition, something that was trying to become one of those and had not decided yet. "The termination was 14 years ago," he said. "You approved his access." "I did," I said. "He met the clinical criteria. The approval stands unconditionally. Nothing I am about to tell you changes his access to Calicept." Jerome set a folder on the table in front of me. I had asked him to prepare it the day before. I opened it. "That's the first document," I said. I had 3 more. The first document was a copy of my original compliance reports, the 3 written filings I had submitted to Hensley Biosciences Compliance Office in September and October of that year. I had kept copies. I had kept them in a fireproof lockbox in my apartment in Austin, and then in Baltimore, and then in Rockville, and then in the built-in safe in my office at Callaway Biopharmaceutical. I had kept them for 14 years not because I thought I would ever use them, but because they were documentation of something that had happened, and I did not discard documentation. I slid the first report across the table. Carter looked at it without touching it. "The data irregularities I reported," I said, "were substantive. The compound your father's team was developing never reached market. It failed in phase III trials 3 years after I left, citing safety signals in the patient population that were consistent with what I had flagged in the phase II cohort data. The failure cost Hensley Biosciences $31 million in sunk development costs and resulted in the dissolution of their research division." I paused. "I'm not telling you this to assign blame at this remove. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that what I was fired for reporting was real." Carter's hands were flat on the table now, still. "The second document," I said, and Jerome set the next folder in front of me, "is a copy of the non-disparagement agreement I signed as a condition of my severance. It expired after 10 years, which means I am under no restriction in discussing any of this. I am not violating any legal agreement by speaking with you now. Patricia Hensley Greer leaned forward very slightly. What is the purpose of this meeting? Transparency, I said. Your father's estate attorney contacted me 6 weeks ago regarding a provision in his will. A bequest to the Hensley Biosciences Charitable Foundation, earmarked for a research grant in KRAS Oncology Therapeutics, naming Callaway Biopharmaceutical and naming me specifically. I set the copy of the letter from Gregory Pfeiffer on the table. I believe your father knew, before the compassionate use application was submitted, that I was the person who had built this drug. The bequest and the application arrived within the same window. That may be coincidence, it may not be. Carter picked up the Pfeiffer letter, he read it, he set it down with deliberate care. My father didn't tell us about this, he said. His voice had changed, not broken, but altered in the way that voices change when something has been absorbed that cannot be unabsorbed. I know, I said. He didn't tell us about you. No. Something crossed his face then, something private that I did not try to read. He looked down at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, there was something in his expression that had nothing to do with posture or grip. Dr. Callaway, he said, what is the third document? I had asked David Reinhold to prepare it. It had taken him 4 days, and he had called it unusual, and he had also called it exactly right. The third document was a letter from Callaway Biopharmaceutical, signed by me, formally declining the estate bequest. I slid it across the table. The $400,000 your father designated for the foundation grant, I said. I'm declining it. Callaway Biopharmaceutical does not need his money. What I built without it. I want the record to be clear about that. Carter stared at the document for a long moment. The fourth document, I said, and Jerome set the final folder down with the quiet efficiency that made him exceptional at his job, is a letter I wrote to Dr. Osai Bonsu's office this morning, confirming that your father's compassionate use access to Calicept is approved for the full treatment course, at no cost, with no conditions. Whatever happened between your father and me 14 years ago is not a clinical matter. He is a patient with a specific mutation and a confirmed indication. He gets the drug. The room was very still for a long moment. Patricia Hensley Greer, who had been watching me since the beginning with that measuring attention, exhaled very slowly through her nose. It was not a sigh of relief. It was the exhale of someone who has been holding a position and has just released it. Carter looked at the 4 documents arranged in a row on the table. He looked at me. Why, he said. Why the 4 documents? Why tell us any of this? You could have approved the access and said nothing. I thought about what to say. I had thought about this question, actually, in the same way I had thought about most things over the past 14 years, which was carefully and privately and for as long as it required. Because I spent 14 years building something in silence, I said, and I am done with silence as a strategy. The silence was useful when I needed it. It protected the work. But your father wrote 4 sentences in a handwritten addendum to his estate documents that said he made an error in judgment. He wrote that the science was sound. He wrote that I deserved better. I paused. He said it in a legal filing in Austin, Texas, where I would not easily find it. He did not say it to me. I looked at Carter. I want you to give him a message from me. You can tell him that his error in judgment cost me $14,200 and my job and approximately 3 months of sleep, and that I subsequently spent 14 years building the only drug that can help him survive. You can tell him the drug is approved, and you can tell him that the score, as far as I'm concerned, is settled. Carter was quiet for a long time. That's it, he said finally. That's it, I said. He looked at the documents again. Then he looked at me with an expression that I will not pretend I know the name for. It was somewhere between bewildered and something closer to relief, and it had nothing in it that resembled victory for either of us. Thank you, he said. It came out plainly. Not formally, just that, I nodded. Jerome collected the folders after they left. Felicity brought me coffee I had not asked for and set it on the desk without comment. I sat in the 3rd-floor conference room for a few minutes after they were gone, looking at the empty chairs. Richard Hensley began his treatment course with Calicept on April 3rd. His oncology team at Meridian Oncology Partners in Scottsdale reported to Jerome at the 6-week mark that his imaging showed a partial response, tumor burden reduction of 41%. The mutation was responding to the inhibitor the way my structural model said it would. I received the update report and filed it with the compassionate use case record and thought about Denise Quarteng and her note about the faces of her students. The Hensley Biosciences Charitable Foundation, following the declined bequest from Callaway Biopharmaceutical, reallocated the $400,000 to two independent research scientists at institutions I had not chosen. David Reinhold confirmed the reallocation in a letter from Gregory Pfeiffer in late April. The record showed that Callaway Biopharmaceutical had declined the grant. The record also showed why. I was satisfied with both facts. Carter Hensley sent me an email 4 weeks after the consultation. It was brief. It said his father had asked him to convey something, and that his father's words were, "I owe her more than this drug can repay." Carter added, in his own words, that he had not known what his father had done in November of that year, and that knowing it had changed how he understood some things he had grown up believing about his family. He did not elaborate. I did not ask him to. I replied to Carter's email in 3 sentences. I wished his father a continued response to treatment. I said I hoped the family had the time it needed. I meant both of those things completely. My life in Rockville, Maryland, is specific and full. I lead a company of 63 people who are building the next generation of targeted oncology therapies. I run twice a week on the trail that passes the reservoir near my apartment, in the early morning before the city gets loud. I have a standing dinner on the first Thursday of every month with Dr. Priya Natarajan, who retired from the NIH 2 years ago and is writing a book about the history of targeted cancer therapy, and who still listens the way she always did, still and complete. I called Dr. Equincy in Baltimore when the approval letter arrived in January, and he said, "PDB accession codes," and I laughed for the first time that day. I called my mother after the consultation. I told her about Callaway Biopharmaceutical, not for the first time, but for the first time completely. I told her about the non-disparagement agreement and the severance and the fellowship application and the paper I had kept in my wallet. She was quiet for a long time. "You did all of this," she said. "Yes," I said, "without telling us." "Yes," she was quiet again. "I should have asked more questions," she said. It was not an apology exactly, but it was honest, and at 64 years old it was probably the closest to one I was going to get. "It's okay," I said. And it was, not because the indifference had not been real, but because I had stopped requiring anything from it. That is not the same as forgiving it. It is something quieter than forgiveness. It is just the point at which you understand that you built what you built entirely on your own, and that is not a wound anymore. It is simply the shape of what happened. I think about Richard Hensley sometimes. Not often, and not with anything that feels like bitterness. I think about the 4 sentences he wrote in a handwritten addendum to his estate documents, in a law office in Austin, in a room I was never meant to enter. I think about what it costs a man like that to write those 4 sentences and seal them in a legal filing, instead of saying them to the person who needed to hear them. I think that says something true about him, and something true about the kind of silence that becomes a habit, and something true about the way people wait too long to say the things that matter. He and I are not the same, but we both know what it is to choose the document over the conversation. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence belongs entirely to you, and the people who dismissed you while you were building it have no claim on what you become. 2. Documentation is not paranoia. It is the language institutions speak, and the people who understand that early are the ones who are still standing when the moment requires evidence. 3. Your identity is not the sum of what your family expected from you. It is the accumulated weight of every decision you made when no one was watching and nothing was guaranteed. Was I wrong to decline Richard Hensley's $400,000 estate bequest, to refuse the one material acknowledgement he was trying to give me, instead of accepting it as the record of what he owed? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.